Good evening. Welcome to Inside City Hall for Thursday, July 30th, 2020. I'm Errol Louis. For a few hours today, our troubled and divided country turned its eyes to the funeral of a man who is almost universally acknowledged as a national hero. Congressman John R. Lewis, a civil rights icon, was laid to rest at a funeral where 3 current presidents spoke, although not the current one. Lewis was remembered as a young student activist who devoted his time to fighting for racial justice and moral clarity. He was especially noted for focusing on the importance of preserving the right to vote, something that former President Barack Obama touched on in his eulogy.
You want to honor John? Let's honor him by revitalizing the law that he was willing to die for. Naming it the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that is a fine tribute. But John wouldn't want us to stop there, just trying to get back to where we already were. Once we pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, we should keep marching to make it even better by making sure every American is automatically registered to vote, including former inmates who've earned their second chance.
Those remarks came on the same day that President Trump repeatedly attempted to spread doubt about the validity of the upcoming elections, going so far as to suggest that mail-in voting and mail-in ballots might not be a fair election. And this is happening, of course, before a single vote has been cast. Now, in recent days, the president has pointed to New York as an example, citing problems with our primary in June. Here at New York 1, we've been examining the mail-in system for that primary, which handled a record number of mail-in ballots and led to a month's worth of counting. One issue that has come up is the process for invalidating some ballots, an issue that is currently in the courts. Our Emily No picks up the story now and explains where things stand in that legal case. Good evening, Emily.
Good evening, Errol. Yes, President Trump tonight calling New York's primary elections a mess and a disaster, speaking to the tens of thousands of ballots that were preliminarily invalidated before the absentee ballot count even began. But we look tonight at the thousands of ballots that were tossed for a reason that is not the fault of the voter.
It's not you, it's them. Thousands of absentee voters who did everything right this primary still had their ballots invalidated. The reason? Post offices don't always date stamp prepaid mail, so ballots received by the Board of Elections after the June 23rd postmark deadline and before the June 30th arrival deadline may not bear proof that they were mailed on time. Government watchdog Susan Lerner called it
unfortunate conjunction of a lot of unintended consequences. Definitely we want to see postage paid reply envelopes for absentee ballots. I think in setting that up, the governor really had no insight into the current procedures at the post office.
The postmark snafu is one of several during the city's pandemic election, but there are efforts to remedy it through litigation and legislation. Assembly candidate Emily Gallagher and congressional candidate Suraj Patel have sued the state to count the unpostmarked ballots. Meanwhile, the U.S. Postal Service said its policy is to date stamp all ballots, regardless of postage payment method. Representatives say they'll continue working with New York officials toward a successful general election. Additionally, State Senator Zellner Myrie has introduced a bill to rely on Board of Elections timestamps, not just post office postmarks.
These are ballots that were sent on time, but because they don't have the time signifier of a postmark, they still have the time signifier of a Board of Elections receipt stamp.
Brooklyn Democratic Party Chair Rodneyse Bichotte says 4% of unpostmarked ballots were tossed in the borough, which amounts to 4,500 votes. The issue could be with one Brooklyn post office. Bichotte points to an underfunded postal system.
You have a limited number of workers, you have hours that are being slashed, you have resources that are not available.
She, Lerner, and Myrie say more reform must pass before the general election.
We are under really, really dire circumstances because this federal administration is going to do everything it can to discredit the process.
And that was, of course, a reference to President Trump, who, again, has been doubling down on New York as what he sees as an example of the invalidity and the crisis to come that might accompany mail-in balloting in the fall. We won't know the official total of invalidated ballots in New York's primaries until Tuesday. That's when the City Board of Elections is certifying the results of the primary that also marks 6 weeks since Election Day. Errol?
Emily, we certainly want every vote to be counted, but as far as we know, even before Tuesday, can we say whether or not the outcome of any race would have been affected by this post office issue?
The race that we're watching most closely when it comes to this postmark issue is that between Karen Maloney and Suraj Patel. Patel repeatedly cites the 12,500 ballots that were tossed preliminarily in their district, but he and Maloney both agree that when it comes to the postmark complication, it's only about 1,200. And considering that her lead over him now is 3,700, that's just not enough to make up the deficit.
Okay, we'll continue watching that. Thank you, Emily. In the nation's capital, the clock is ticking down to the expiration of federal benefits for millions of Americans left unemployed